There we go. Good morning and welcome to Bible study for Wednesday, May 26th. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 23. So we've been making our way through the Old Testament chapter by chapter, and Deuteronomy is the final book of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible said to be authored by Moses as the primary source material. And Deuteronomy is Moses' final sermon to the people before they enter the promised land. And so it is a re-summary of the people's history through the wilderness. It's a re-summation of the law, and it is his final words of wisdom to give to the people before they go into the promised land. And so previously in chapter 22, it was talking about adultery and divorce and sexual morality. And now we're coming into worship, chapter 23, verse 1. If a man's testicles are crushed or his penis is cut off, he may not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. So this is a word for only the Israelites. And we know this because by the time we get to Acts, you have the Ethiopian eunuch who asks to be baptized, and he is baptized. And there's that famous saying, "What is to prevent me from being baptized? And here's water." And so he is baptized into the family of God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this word is just for the Israelite people in terms of their assembly of the Lord. And you might think, well, this is a very funny thing. Why would this be part of the Hebrew culture and tradition? Remember, the land they are going into is already occupied, and it's occupied by people who practice fertility worship, meaning they're sacrificing their children to the gods in order for their fields to be more productive. And there are also men who sacrifice their fertility by becoming a eunuch in order to gain spiritual favor and worship. So it's a really weird thing for many of us. Not many of us would contemplate voluntarily giving up our parts of our body. But this was part of the cultural practice around them. And so Moses is saying, this is forbidden. It is not part of our God's worship. Now, does this mean that if you were accidentally injured or wounded that you would never be admitted to the Lord? I don't think so, based on what we know of Scripture. But this prohibition is in here to prevent people from voluntarily giving up their fertility to worship another god. Verse 2. If a person is illegitimate by birth, neither he nor his descendants for 10 generations may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. All right, so here you have the presumption that premarital sex exists and that is going to remain a part of the culture. There is no time in the history of humanity when sex only happened between married couples consistently, and it was so far out of the norm for there to be illegitimate birth. There's really no time in history where that was a thing. So this is how God is choosing to deal with it within the Israelites. 10 generations before they may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. For us, we know that this is not true for how we worship, but why might it have been for them? Well, we're going to start a new country. We're going to start a new culture. And this is the time where we're establishing the norms of the culture and what is valued in this culture. And so fidelity and purity is very highly valued by God. And so this is the harsh penalty given to deter this from happening. This is also where quite a bit of stigma still carries on today with the word bastard. For many, many thousands of years, generation after generation, if you were a bastard, that meant you couldn't be part of polite society, you couldn't go to educated schools, you couldn't work in certain fields, you were excluded from your betters, quote unquote. I don't think that's a good and godly thing. No, that's not what is being stated here. It doesn't say that they can't be part of your community and that they're not worthy human beings. It just says they're not permitted to be in the assembly of the Lord, which is the nearer presence of God. So the temple has the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant with it, which is where God dwells with humanity. And it's saying you can't approach the holiest of holies and be near the presence of God until 10 generations have passed. Verse 3, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants for 10 generations may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. These nations did not welcome you with food and water when you came out of Egypt. Instead, they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in distant Aram Naharaim to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to listen to Balaam. He turned the intended curse into a blessing because the Lord your God loves you. As long as you live, you must never promote the welfare and prosperity of the Ammonites or Moabites. So God says these people are not God-fearers. They didn't look after my people as they were asked to do and instead chose to curse them. And so for them to be admitted into the presence of the assembly would make a mockery of your history. Again, when people say generally the New Testament God is peaceful and loving and kind, and the Old Testament God is one of vengeance and destruction, not really. It's all the same God, but it is filtered through the lens of what has happened with those people in that time. And so God says, don't make good friends with your former oppressors. Verse 7, do not detest the Edomites or the Egyptians, because the Edomites are your relatives, and you lived as foreigners among the Egyptians. The third generation of Edomites and Egyptians may enter the assembly of the Lord. So again, what have you done for me lately? The Egyptians, yes, under the last Pharaoh that they served were oppressive and horrible, and the Israelites fled. But it has already been several generations since this occurred, because a whole generation has died off in the wilderness. So time has already passed, and you know that old saying, time heals all wounds. Seems to be that the passage of time lessens the impact of generational sin. So verse 9, when you go to war against your enemies, be sure to stay away from anything that is impure. Any man who becomes ceremonially defiled because of a nocturnal emission must leave the camp and stay away all day. So if you've ever wondered, yes, wet dreams are in the Bible. They say nocturnal emission. Does that mean solo or with someone else? It's not described, but regardless, if you are sexually active at night, you are to stay away all day, and toward evening he must bathe himself, and at sunset he may return to the camp. Again, this is one of those areas of the Bible where scholarship is murky. And does this tie into the verse ahead of it, where this is part of the act of war? And therefore, if you're off going to war, you really shouldn't be distracted by your own personal pleasure seeking. That's not super clear. And different people have interpreted this verse throughout time. But the important thing to remember is this was for the Israelites and not for those who would come later. So we don't have to know exactly why this was there or whether it still holds true for them. We know it doesn't hold true for us. Verse 12, you must have a designated area outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. Each of you must have a spade as part of your equipment. Whenever you relieve yourself, dig a hole with the spade and cover the excrement. The camp must be holy, for the Lord your God moves around in your camp to protect you and to defeat your enemies. He must not see any shameful thing among you, or he will turn away from you. This is just basic hygiene. I've gone hiking on the Appalachian Trail, and yep, you got to bring a spade, and you got to make sure that you're a certain distance away from water sources, and you just take care of things to prevent the spread of diseases. This is a good and thing that God is saying, hey, take care of this in order for you to do well and be prospered. It's still referencing a camp and your enemies. So presumably, again, this is part of going to war, that you will be away from your normal latrines or systems of dealing with human waste. And so here's how you will deal with it. Verse 15, if slaves should escape from their masters and take refuge with you, you must not hand them over to their masters. Let them live among you in any town they choose, and do not oppress them. This is one of those verses in the Bible that is why it was not permitted to give a Bible to enslaved Americans. For a great deal of time, those who were enslaved were not allowed to have the access to the scriptures, and this is part of it, because white American masters had used portions of the Bible to say that, slavery is for your good, or it's part of God's will and God's plan. And so this verse was certainly never included in that narrative that escaped slaves were to be taken care of. This is actually part of why many Christians were part of the Underground Railroad in assisting and helping people escape from slavery and get north towards freedom, because God says if slaves escape, yay, that's a good thing, and you should help them settle into your land and do not oppress them. Verse 17, no Israelite, whether man or woman, may become a temple prostitute. Things you don't think should need to be said, but they do, because again, God knows that we are broken and bent towards sinful behavior. So God's saying, yeah, I really don't want fertility worship or sexual worship. That's not what I want. It's never going to happen in my temple. When you are bringing an offering to fulfill a vow, you must not bring You must not bring to the house of the Lord your God any offering from the earnings of a prostitute, whether a man or woman, for both are detestable to the Lord your God. These are not an industry that God wants a tenth of. God doesn't want this industry to persist. That does not mean that God does condemn or does not love those who serve as prostitutes. Remember, Jesus is often spoken of as eating with sinners and hanging around prostitutes. God is trying to set up a society bent towards justice, and therefore no one should become a prostitute. Nobody should have to. And we're not going to use their earnings to support our economy or our worship. Verse 19, do not charge interest on the loans you make to a fellow Israelite, whether you loan money or food or anything else. You may charge interest to foreigners, but you may not charge interest to Israelites, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you do in the land you're about to enter and occupy. So we're to help our brother and sister, our siblings out. And when we are repaid, we're just repaid what they borrowed, not with interest. Verse 21, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, be prompt in fulfilling whatever you promised him. For the Lord your God demands that you promptly fulfill all your vows, or you will be guilty of sin. However, it is not a sin to refrain from making a vow. But once you've voluntarily made a vow, be careful to fulfill your promise to the Lord your God. Many people, when they are scared or facing great difficulty, will begin to bargain with God. So they'll say, Lord, if you heal my wife, I will never miss a day of church again. Or Lord, if you do this, I will give this amount of money to the poor. And people make these vows all the time. And sometimes, people are healed or the thing you ask for happens. And if you go, well, that was nice, God, thank you very much, but don't keep your part of the bargain, it was a sin. However, it's never a sin just not to make those promises or vows. So, you can ask for God's blessing and God's healing and things, and you don't have to bargain with God in return. But if you do strike a bargain with God, you better keep it. Verse 24, when you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, but you must not carry away any in a basket. And when you enter your neighbor's field of grain, you may pluck the heads of grain with your hand, but you must not harvest it with a sickle. So what does this mean? It means that no one in Israel should be starving. It means that no one in the land that God has given and blessed should go hungry. Everyone has a right to do what they call gleaning, which means you harvest on the edges by hand when you're hungry, and you eat for your day, and then you leave and go home. You can't harvest and take stuff home with you because that would be stealing. But to simply eat when you are hungry from what your neighbor has is not stealing. Basically, God is saying, look, I've created a land with more than enough for everyone. And so those who have a lot are to share with the hungry. But no, the sharing for the hungry still involves the labor of those who are they have to go to the field and harvest what they eat. It's not harvested for them and delivered on their doorstep. There is still some labor and effort to be done. So no one should go hungry who is able to work, is what this societal value is being set up. Other places, the Lord makes specific provisions for widows and orphans and for the disabled. So nobody should go hungry, and we're going to take care of those who are disabled and not able to go and glean. But those of you who, for whatever reason, your crops are bare, you don't have land, something happened, you don't have enough, you won't go hungry either. And we know that this is largely put into practice because we hear about the disciples going about and plucking off heads of grain when they are hungry. And the Pharisees get mad about that because it's a Sabbath and they shouldn't be doing work. But they were hungry and they needed to eat. Chapter 24. Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, he writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man. But if the second husband also turns against her, writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away, or if he dies, The first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. That would be detestable to the Lord. You must not bring guilt upon the land your God is giving you as a special possession. Believe it or not, I know of a couple that has been married 3 times and twice to each other. This is something that happens where people get sick of each other. They argue, they fight, they give up, and they get divorced. And then later on, they realize that life with someone else isn't any better. No marriage is easy. All marriages have conflict. And so they come back together. God says, don't do that. This is part of what Jesus will reference later when they say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? The Pharisees trying to trick Jesus say this, and Jesus says, well, Moses has given you the ability to write a certificate of divorce because your hearts were hardened. So Moses gives this as an option because it is taking care of women who would otherwise be left destitute or be left with no one to provide or care for them. So this is an option for them to be able to go and get married to someone else, to have someone who will care and provide for them. Doesn't mean it's God's utmost good or God's glory. It just means it's allowed. Verse 5, a newly married man must not be drafted into the army or be given any other official responsibilities. He must be free to spend 1 year at home, bringing happiness to the wife he has married. The Bible respects the building of a relationship happens with time spent together and with time to grow in love. Marriage in these days often was done without much pre-planning or dating or building up a relationship, which made it that much more important for that first year for the couple to be together and to have the time to really bond and grow their household together. Verse 6, it is wrong to take a set of millstones or even just the upper millstone as a security for a loan, for the owner uses it to make a living. Basically, don't compound your neighbor's hardship. So if you are a miller by trade and you run on hard times and you need help, they can't take the very thing that you need to make your living away from you as guarantee for the loan. If you're a truck driver, we can't take your truck. If you are an artist, we can't take your brushes and your paint. All of these to say, don't take people's means of extricating themselves from poverty. So not only can you not charge interest to your fellow Israelite, but you can't deprive them of their chance to make their life better. Verse 7, if anyone kidnaps a fellow Israelite and treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. In this way you will purge the evil from among you. It is an unfortunate part of the reality of human brokenness that human trafficking is an ongoing sin that has been present as far back as the Bible and continues still today. There was just a bust recently of a business owner in North Carolina who was holding a mentally challenged man captive to be the dishwasher for his restaurant. And this only came to light because the other employees spoke out. Again, human trafficking is wrong. Using people, enslaving people is wrong, and it's never okay. But it's especially not okay to do to your very own people, and the penalty for doing it is death. Verse 8, In all cases involving serious skin diseases, be careful to follow the instructions of the Levitical priests. Obey all the commands that I have given them, and remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam as you were coming from Egypt. So this is some people's Bible, it says leprosy, but it wasn't so narrow as that. Any skin disease, you were supposed to present yourself to your Levitical priest for inspection and prayer and to be cured or to be ostracized from your community to prevent the further spread of disease. And Miriam was struck with leprosy when she was disobedient to God. So it's saying, remember what happened to Miriam. She was a leader in the church. She was a leader of the Israelites, and she was struck for her disobedience. No one is immune from these requirements. Verse 10, if you lend anything to your neighbor, do not enter his house to pick up the item he is giving as security. You must wait outside while he goes in and brings it out to you. Basically saying you can't go in and take what you want for security. You have to take what the neighbor gives. If your neighbor is poor and gives you his cloak as security for a loan, do not keep the cloak overnight. Return the cloak to its owner by sunset so he can stay warm throughout the night and bless you, and the Lord your God will count you as righteous. So the cloak was your bedroll in the ancient days. This was your blanket. This is what you would use to stay warm at night. Most people didn't have the funds or the material resources to have both bedding and a cloak. You just had a cloak. So what this is saying is, if this is the only thing this person has to offer as security, you have to give it back every night. And they're supposed to give it back to you the next day if they haven't repaid your loan. And then you keep giving it back every night so that they're not suffering unduly because of their impoverished state. God is really against punishing the poor just for the fact that they're poor. Verse 14, never take advantage of poor and destitute laborers, whether they are fellow Israelites or foreigners living in your towns. You must pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and counting on it. If you don't, they might cry out to the Lord against you, and it would be counted against you as sin. This covenant and this instruction is really important to keep the spirit of, but not the letter of. Back then, bread didn't have preservatives, and so food didn't keep for days on end. You didn't have refrigeration, and so what would happen is you would work all day, you would get paid your wages, and then you would go with those wages and buy your food and your lodging for the night. So people who didn't have their own home would pay for a lodging nightly. And so if you did not pay your laborers a fair wage, they would not have the ability to eat dinner or have a place to sleep. So you would be depriving them of having any sort of reasonable standard of life. Christians have taken this farther to say, it is our duty to advocate for fair labor practices, and it is our duty to advocate for a living wage where people can afford housing and food and have a minimum standard of living that is acceptable. And that's for everybody, not just for people with the right education or the people for the right family history. This is for everyone, that they should have a minimum standard of living. And if we don't do that, and then we don't care for the people who work for us, that is counted as sin. So one of the things that happened here, when we went to hire someone to clean the church, I calculated, what does someone need to make per hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Port St. Lucie? and it came out to $15 an hour. Now, this isn't a 40-hour job, but you would have to work 40 hours at $15 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Port St. Lucie and to pay your utilities and have food. So I said, we're not going to pay anything less than $15 an hour for any position at the church, because this is what is a fair standard of labor. And some people are like, well, we could get somebody to work for less. I'm like, yes, we could, but that wouldn't make it just. And so that's something that I hold to in my own life, to make sure that it's not counted as sin against me. I'm not part of the reason someone is trapped in a cycle of poverty. Verse 16, parents must not be put to death for the sins of their children, nor children for the sins of their parents. Those deserving to die must be put to death for their own crimes. It was not unheard of to kill a whole family based on what someone in that family had done. And God is saying, don't do that. As much as possible, we want to not contribute to blood feuds and people at war with each other for generations. We hold the individuals accountable for their sin and then let it go. Verse 17, true justice must be given to foreigners living among you and to orphans, and you must never accept a widow's garment as security for her debt. Always remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you from your slavery. That is why I've given you this command. Basically, don't treat others how you were treated when you were once slaves in Egypt. Take care of the orphans and the widows. So if you, not that long ago in our history, if you lived in a neighborhood and, there was a little old lady living in that neighborhood, you would periodically bring her some food from your table. You would check in on her, make sure things were going okay for her. And if a woman's husband died, the men of the neighborhood would do the yard work and would take care of the house and make sure that she was taken care of. Our society has changed very drastically to be one where most people are uprooted. The average American now moves 2 to 4 times in their lifetime. I'm up to move 17 or 18. So it's really hard to build these types of supportive relationships now, but this is where the church steps in to be part of this process of caring for the poor among us and making sure that they are okay. Verse 19, when you are harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. So if you're so blessed that you happen to leave some of your crop in the field, well, you clearly didn't need it anyway. You weren't that mindful of it. It didn't matter that much to you, versus this might be the thing that prevents starvation for others. So leave it, let them have it. Then when you beat the olives from your olive trees, don't go over the boughs twice. Leave the remaining olives for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. So when you were harvesting your olive trees, you'd take a big stick and you'd go, what I just did was 2. Don't do that. Give it 1 good whack. Whatever falls is yours. And then that allows some to remain on the tree for others to come and harvest. Verse 21, when you gather the grapes in your vineyard, don't glean the vines after they are picked. Leave the remaining grapes for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I'm giving you this command. So I'm going to say something that might seem controversial, but capitalism runs contrary to the word of God. And here's why. capitalism is based on maximizing profit and output and minimizing overhead. And so this type of society that seeks to have 100% productivity, or as high of a productivity as possible, and capitalizing upon every possible return, is contrary to God's vision of the world. God asks for us to not live to the very edge of our means, but to leave some that will remain for those who don't have the same means we do, i.e., we are blessed to be a blessing. That's part of why I emphasize tithing, even though, yes, it is an Old Testament concept, but this idea that we are called to not live to the very edge of our means, but to use some of what we have then to bless the church, to also bless others and to care for others, because this is one of the few things that we as Christians can do in a capitalist society to ensure that there are margins for others to glean off of. Because not many of us have an orange grove. Not many of us have an olive grove. Not many of us have a vineyard. We can't leave stuff hanging for the poor of our community to come get, although some of us may have gardens that we allow people to harvest from. But we have our income that we take in, that we can leave some behind and use for the good of others. So that's always been really important to me, to make that a practice. Now, I don't give everything that I give to charity to the church. I have some things that I give in a lot of different ways, but I make sure that I'm always giving back out of what I've been given, because I think that's how God will bless the world. So chapter 25 takes us into disputes and arguments. Suppose two people take a dispute to court, and the judge declares that one is right and the other is wrong. If the person in the wrong is sentenced to be flogged, the judge must command him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of lashes appropriate to the crime. But never give more than 40 lashes. More than 40 lashes would publicly humiliate your neighbor. Again, the idea that there is a maximum penalty, and the idea that we're not to do punishment that is cruel and unusual. That's where we get that phrasing from. And this idea that this was actually a merciful limit in those days based on the culture around them. Nowadays, we would say, well, you shouldn't flog anybody. Yes, but this was a common practice in the day, and God works with us where we are at and bends us more and more towards justice and righteousness. Verse 4, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. This idea that anything that's part of the system of work deserves to be compensated for its work. So you can't keep a muzzle on your ox to keep it from eating as it's working hard. Same thing of you need to provide food breaks and bathroom breaks for your employees. Like, you have to allow the basic needs of people to be met even in the midst of their work. Verse 5, if two brothers are living together on the same property and one of them dies without a son, his widow may not be married to anyone outside the family. Instead, her husband's brother should marry her and have intercourse with her to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law. Yep, that's interesting, isn't it? But again, this goes back to that property was transmitted through the sons, and therefore, and also in your old age, you were cared for by your sons. So if you didn't have a son, your old age was going to be real unpleasant, and it was going to be destitute as a woman, and you would be reliant solely upon the charity of others. What this is saying is to prevent there from being a large class of people who were widowed and destitute. It was saying it is your duty to care for your brother's wife, to provide her sons, and to ensure that the land would continue in her family line. So while many of us would think, well, that's gross and disgusting, yeah, but it was merciful for the time. The first son she bears to him will be considered the son of the dead brother, so that his name will not be forgotten in Israel. But if the man refuses to marry his brother's widow, she must go to the town gate and say to the elders assembled there, my husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He refuses to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law by marrying me. The elders of the town will then summon him and talk with him. If he still refuses and says, I don't want to marry her, the widow must walk over to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. Then she must declare, this is what happens to a man who refuses to provide his brother with children. Ever afterward in Israel, his family will be referred to as the family of the man whose sandal was pulled off. So this seems kind of silly to us in terms of why is that so shameful? In the ancient world, your feet were an extension of your manhood. Don't know why. I just know that this was part of the culture, that your feet was also a euphemism for your penis and your genitalia. And so to have your sandal taken off and to be spit in your face was a sign of very deep public shame. And then that says, forevermore, you're going to be laughed at and said is the man who was unclothed, the man who was unmanned, as it were, is what this phrase is implying. And so it's creating a deep social stigma and shame to try and force people to do the right thing and to take care of one another. Verse 11, if two Israelite men get into a fight and the wife of one tries to rescue her husband by grabbing the testicles of the other man, you must cut off her hand. Show her no pity. All right, so you can't fight dirty in order to protect your husband. This idea that there's shame in doing so. Verse 13, you must use accurate scales when you weigh out merchandise, and you must use full and honest measures. Yes, always use honest weights and measures so that you will enjoy a long life in the land your God is giving you. All who cheat with dishonest weights and measures are detestable to the Lord your God. So remember when we get to Jesus and the flipping over of the tables, and we say, you've made my father's house a den of robbers and thieves? Yeah, because they're using dishonest weights and unfair conversion for the temple shekel. So they're robbing people both in converting their money and they're giving them second-rate animals, and it's just not good. And God has said multiple times, don't do that. Don't cheat people. This is again why I say capitalism can run contrary to God's vision of human flourishing, because capitalism is in part where you get to the improper disposal of waste, or the inattentiveness to how harmful certain products might be, or the hiding of public harm that things can do because we don't want to impact profits. God doesn't want that. We're to take care of one another and to charge a fair price for a fair product. Verse 17, never forget what the Amalekites did to you as you came from Egypt. They attacked you when you were exhausted and weary, and they struck down those who were straggling behind. They had no fear of God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies in the land he is giving you as a special possession, you must destroy the Amalekites and erase their memory from under heaven. Never forget this. Why? Why would God tell them to go and destroy another race or nation? God is saying, once you've had your time of rest, go destroy them, because remember, they're just there waiting for you to get tired and fall down again to take their opportunity. Don't let them do that. So then we have this time of the harvest offerings and tithes, but I think we're going to pick up there next week, because I think this is a good place to stop, because we've talked about how to have a fair society and to set things up so that people will be blessed.